Okay, the last time we met, we spoke about what actually happened to the class of 76. And I think part of what we have to, come to understand is that, you know, there had to be a relationship, or it would be assumed that there would be a relationship between the student movement and the exiled movement. And it is at this stage that it becomes important to understand what the reaction of the exiled movement would have been. And I think we covered a lot of that, starting with, and we're focusing mainly, for reasons that I did explain, that, we were focusing mainly on the student demographic, or the student who went into exile, joined the ANC, and ultimately ended up in MK. This is not to suggest that there were no students who actually joined the PAC and later APLA, but that is something that we can, focus on as a separate theme. For now, what we focused on was how the, that class of 1976 that would become members of the ANC in exile and ultimately join MK, what their fate would have been. I think we mentioned a few things. The first would have been the Black September event, where there was a poisoning. And part of what we said was that this started a kind of a witch hunt, but a particular group had been identified as possible, as sellouts and agents of the apartheid state. But just in terms of seeing them as a collective, it is as a collective of black radicals that they were smeared with this, with this kind of or this kind of characterization of them. Now, that was following the food poisoning that happened in September 1977. But we went on to explain that the witch hunt lasted, for quite an extended period of time, going up to the beginning of 1980, the end of 1979, going into 1980. So that it actually absorbed a great deal of resources and time in an attempt to establish, who these sellouts would have been. Well, there are quite a number of things that happened which were probably not related to this. For instance, the visit of O.R. Tambo and some of the executive members, to Vietnam, which was in itself, it would have taken attention away from what was happening. But on OR's return, an opportunity was given to cadres, to come and explain, what in fact was happening and how they can mend the relationship with the leadership. And this happened towards the end of 79 into 1980. But the witch hunt actually continued. And it is important to explain the basis of this, of the characterization of the class of 76 as possible apartheid spies. There is no doubt, that the Luthuli detachment would have been in exile for nearly 15 years. And if there were any among them who could be suspected to be apartheid spies, they could have been identified. But, coming into, the post-1976 period, this idea of, branding people as apartheid spies was actually used to mask something else, something much bigger. And what is that? It is the fact that this new generation, that was going into MK, joining ANC and going into MK, were actually black radicals, just in terms of the political consciousness that they had. Their political consciousness was actually shaped, by circumstances that were articulated by the black consciousness movement. Now, this is something that is actually contested, in liberation struggle history. So that the whole idea that the entire movement of the 1970s was the brainchild of the Black consciousness movement is up to this day actually contested. And I think the contestation is going to become even more intense, in the coming years, seeing that it will be 50 years after, the eruption on June 16th, 1976. But the point that we need to emphasize here is that this is a generation of young black people in the urban areas of South Africa, particularly in what was then the PWV area, which was the epicenter of this movement, which is today, in terms of the provincial demarcations, it is what is Gauteng today roughly. So it is in that region that the epicenter was actually located for the 1970s movement. But the issue here is that a closer examination, of this particular generation of urban black society, and particularly just in terms of the age, because that also becomes absolutely critical. Dismissing them as kids actually again obfuscates the fact that these were, young adults who were matured in mind and who could actually take, independent decisions, and they did. Now, there are quite a number of things that gave character, both social and political character, to that movement. And these young people were at the center of that movement. The issue here is that once they start leaving the country and they join MK and they join APLA, what then happens to the black radical tradition that actually shaped their political consciousness? Now, I think for purposes of clarity here, let us try and understand how the ANC, the PAC, and probably the unity movement of South Africa in exile, responded to this uprising, and how they characterized this movement, just in terms of what the ANC, the PAC, and other exiled movements' position would have been. At first, the reaction was, that they actually didn't know what was happening here. But as the unrest actually continued for the next 2 to 3 months, this is when the exiled formations, started making different kinds of claims about involvement in what was happening. But here is the issue. The issue here is that this movement was inspired by a black radical tradition. And this is something that particularly the ANC had to deal with. It may well be said that the PAC may have, there may have been a kind of a resonance, between what the PAC stood for as a kind of a black radical tradition and what the students' movement actually represented. Do you agree? I mean, so even within the exiled community, there was that recognition, that this new movement is actually inspired by, a historical black tradition that can actually be traced back to earlier forms of resistance. But there is a kind of reluctance, both on the part of, academics, constructing the narrative of the liberation struggle history, as well as political formations themselves. And the issue here is that just in terms of, tapping into the historical legacy of the liberation struggle, this movement of the 1970s, tended to be much closer to the Pan-Africanist movement of the 1950s and early 1960s. And at the center of that Pan-Africanist movement of the early 1960s in particular, it is Poqo. Now, if Poqo happens to be, a kind of something that this movement would look back to, that is something that is going to be, rubbing a lot of people in powerful positions up the wrong way. And that is what had to be dealt with. So when the camps opened in Angola and the ANC started taking in these recruits, the most important thing to do was to empty the young recruits of all the black radical predisposition that they had and make sure that they learn new, kind of revolutionary theories that were not actually based, on black nationalist and black radical, kinds of tendencies.
Critically lived experience.
But also, yes, the lived experience is most definitely, what was being articulated not only in the streets of Soweto, but in the streets of Langa, Nyanga, and Guguletu. But here's the most important thing here, and this is in relation to what actually happens in other parts of the country. Around the same time as the unrest goes on in Soweto from June right down to the end of the year, there are similar outbreaks elsewhere. In Cape Town, it happens, in Port Elizabeth, in East London, but the traditions tend to be different. And for reasons that we may have to explain much later, the Cape Town, kind of mobilization is around a completely different issue. A lot of it has to do with, anti-colored affairs department lobbies, which are all about, whether colors should be incorporated into a kind of a ruling class category, or whether they should actually identify with black people. But at the same time, there was unrest in Langa. Langa High School was also particularly involved here. And the most important thing about, this kind of mobilization in the Cape Peninsula is that there was, a conscious attempt to bring in the working population into the unrest. And in Soweto too, that actually happened. But the issue here is that the reason why we have to think about this kind of formulation, when the exiled movement actually criticized the student movement and the mass movement of the 1970s, the criticism centered around the absence of class consciousness. And that became the issue, that this movement did not have an understanding of the fact that the working class has to take leadership of the revolution. And this is what the new recruits were supposed to be taught. And no doubt there were people who we talked about this last week. We talked about Jack Simon, who was actually a lecturer at UCT before he left the country, and he was a member of the SACP. So, the new recruits would have to be taken through their paces to understand the Marxist-Leninist, kind of approach to the South African liberation struggle. But the idea here is that they had to be completely deschooled, of the tradition that actually shaped their political consciousness. We did explain that, after 1980, you then have the Matola raid. The Matola raid also becomes absolutely critical because it merely consolidates, this idea that the black radicals are actually sellouts and have to be dealt with. And the Matola raid happens in 1981. But between 1981 and 1983, there is a new search. Again, resources are being expended here. There is a new search for sellouts because the Matola raid is actually blamed once again, on black radicals, the new recruits, into ANC and MK. And, that witch hunt actually continues right down to August 1983. And in August 1983, after a great deal of pressure from the new recruits to be deployed back into the country, and engage, with this white supremacy state, what the ANC hierarchy decided to do was to send them to the front and join MPLA in the war against UNITA. And by December of 1983, when they came back, we did explain that already they had grievances. This led to the Vienna uprising. And the Vienna uprising once again, put the new recruits, on a kind of a trial. And, during 1984, right down to August 1984, there was this continued witch hunt of, black radicals who were supposed to be sellouts. But on the 22nd of August 1984, in a tribunal that was held, in Luanda, in Angola, 15 of those that were accused were found guilty, and 7 of them were executed on the 24th of August 1984. Now that is where we ended, just explaining, how the bulk, of the class of 76 was actually integrated into the ANC and into MK. What is important here is to understand that, it was the black radical tradition that was, on trial here. And the fact that, the, this new generation of activists were black radicals who would never actually go down well with, with the established ANC thinking at this time. Now, thinking about how the Vienna uprising was resolved in the final analysis, it had to be the Angolan army that intervened and, gave guarantees to the mutineers, that they should lay down their arms and that, they would not be handed over to MK and ANC, leadership hierarchy. But after doing that, the Angolan commander actually handed the arms over to the ANC and to MK. And this was quite a betrayal, on these guys. We are not mentioning names here because, some of the people are still around. But there are very important actors in this, in this drama as it unfolded. Between the end of 1983, December 1983, and the executions in August 1984, the unrest had actually been going on in the camps. And, the people at the center here, I know it's a bit, one feels a bit uneasy, but Chris Hani was, part of the leadership hierarchy that was having to deal with this. Joe Modise was another. Thabo Mbeki was also very much in the forefront, just in terms of, dealing with this mutiny. And all three were actually reporting to Oliver Tambo at this time. But at the same time, we had, and this the ANC hasn't come forward to refute. And I'd love to see any refutations of this kind of a narrative, which is actually documented. But at about the same time, Moses Mabhida also features quite prominently, as one of those who were enforcing, all these kinds of measures, on these new recruits. And ultimately, as you go into 1986, 1987, Jacob Zuma's name, also crops up from time to time. So part of what I'm trying to explain here is that there may well have been, some kinds of serious engagement with the white supremacy state, just in terms of, how the armed propaganda campaign actually unfolded, between 1977 and 1986, in that 10-year period. We can mention the maybe study with the Koch Street shooting that had Solomon Mahlangu, the Silverton siege, right down to 1983, 84. The bombing at Church Street in Pretoria, or the bombings in the police stations that actually happened during that period. All of this was part of the armed propaganda campaign. And there is no doubt that at the center of, all of these activities were the 1976 recruits, the June 16 detachment. And, but the question then arises, just in terms of the black radical predisposition, that this cohort of recruits had, once they were deployed, it actually became problematic because Uh, the issue here is that once they were armed and then, let loose on South Africa, white civil society was actually imperiled. And that is something that, the ANC had to deal with. The point here is that, armed struggle could have been directed at particular objectives and outcomes. But there was a great deal of investment, in terms of resources and time that went into deschooling the new recruits so that they can be able to understand, the more academic, kind of an approach to the struggle. And that in itself may have had a particular effect on what the outcome was. So just in terms of what happens in the 1980s, taking the class of 76 beyond the borders of South Africa, one can begin to see that while armed propaganda campaign did probably have an impact, but the overall impact on the class of 76 was actually to defang this class of the black radical venom, that they had in them. And that would have had the effect of blunting armed struggle as a useful instrument, towards changing South Africa.
Indeed, indeed. Well, quite satisfactory. But that is where you left off last time.
Yes. Now, the question that we need to deal with is that if the focus in exile was one, to try and deal with the black radical predisposition, of these new recruits, to what extent did that filter through into South Africa so that it shaped, the kind of, the mass movement that actually erupted, in 1984. And that is what we are going to be dealing with next. We have to assess whether the ways in which the ANC in exile was dealing with the black radical tradition, as it actually embraced its new recruits. And we know that the ways in which it dealt with that was actually to brutally, obliterate, the black radical tradition,
This is brutally and violently.
brutally and violently. And part of what we need to work out here is to what extent did that actually shape the mass movement, of the 1980s? And, would that actually have, set the pace or set the stage, for the black on black violence that was experienced in the 1980s?
Are there any other additional aspects that you might want to?
In fact, there are, and this is something that people have to understand. What we have been focusing on would be the class of 76 that went to join the ANC and ultimately MK. And we've seen what their fate would have been.
Yes.
But there is another which we probably may still have to deal with. And it is those that went into the PAC and APLA. But there's a third group, which we haven't actually accounted for. And that is the student movement itself. And by that I mean high school students, who were members of the Soweto Students Representative Council. Because, and again here, it helps us to be able to reflect, on how the exiled movement perceived, the students' movement. Because part of what we have to understand here is that as early as August 1976, in fact, when Tsietsi Mashinini left the country at the end of August 1976, and going into September 1976, already there were conversations going on, among students about the ANC, about the PAC, and about the exiled movement, and already messages that were being transmitted, from Gaborone in Botswana back into South Africa, was that students leaving the country, particularly after the second week of September, students who were under pressure and were forced to leave the country, either because they were sought by police or they just felt they never wanted to wait for the moment when they would be pounced upon. In fact, during this period, this is when, you know, departures by students had actually grown into a wave by the second week of September, going, into the third and last week of September. And it is during this period that there were messages transmitted to students that in the event you want to leave the country, do not join the ANC, do not join the PAC. And this was to lay the foundation for the establishment of a student formation in exile, which was established during the Easter weekend of 1979. And that became the South African Youth Revolutionary Council. Now, the fact that you had SEICO being established would have meant that you had quite a large demographic of students, who did not join the ANC or the PAC. But the second important thing to think about is that not all students of the class of 76 who joined the ANC went on to join MK. There's a huge demographic of them who did not actually go into the camps to undergo military training. A perfect example is actually what happened in Lesotho, Botswana, and Swaziland during 1978. A huge number of new recruits, students who left the country from June 16 right up to, around June 1978, they were enticed into taking scholarships to go and study in West Germany. Now, this was not in pursuit, of the liberation struggle. The idea was actually to empty the SADC, South Africa's neighboring countries, of idle students and young people who had left the country in 1976. There was a sense.
And address the security concerns.
Exactly.
Of the apartheid state.
Yes. There was a sense that, the scholarship, if you think about it, the scholarship was actually made available by Helmut Kohl's government, who was Chancellor of West Germany at the time. This is before the unification of East and West Germany. And Helmut Kohl was known to be a friend of V.J. Foster. And suddenly West Germany is offering a massive number of black students in the SADC region scholarships. Now, that actually was an expression of no confidence, by these students in the military, solution, or in joining the armed formations either of the ANC or of the PAC. And that is quite significant. In actual fact, by 1978, you have a situation where the class of 76 already in Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and not in military camps, would not go into the military camps anyway. And this actually becomes, the trend in 1978. And in Botswana, in 1978, the government decided that because these people were idle in Gaborone, it established a camp in the north of the country in Dukwe, next to Francistown. And this is where all these students were taken to. Now, that actually accounts for the spread of that particular cohort in West Africa after 1979 and going into the 1980s. And by then, some of them would be considered to be affiliated to the South African Youth Revolutionary Council. And once it was established, SEICO had learned the lessons. They felt that they were not going to be in exile for the next 20 years. And within 2 years, Kgotso Seatlholo was back in the country, to try and organize students. But unfortunately, he was captured and, put on trial and sentenced to 14 years. But what is important here to understand, is that there was a cohort of students who participated, in the June 16 movement. And, these students were not going to join either the ANC or the PAC. And there were serious attempts on their part, to try and influence developments inside the country. In fact, I often argue that had Kgotso Seatlholo at least succeeded. You would have had a situation where instead of having a COSAS being responsible for the mass movement of the 1980s, you would have had a SEICO, with black radical predispositions, actually leading, the student movement of the 1980s. And now getting into the 1980s, that's the scenario that we have. The scenario that emerges here is that the class of 1976, you know, quite a big chunk of it had gone into exile, had joined the ANC and the PAC, and we have records of some of those that returned, participating, in a number of campaigns that we know about, that we probably at some stage may want to isolate, and talk about as either successful or unsuccessful campaigns.
Right.
But the one thing that has never been addressed, about the class of 76 is the fact that those that left the country and those that were imprisoned, and those that died were only a fraction of the class of 76. What happened to the majority of students who were at different stages of completing matric, from Form 1 to Form 5? What happens to them at the end of the unrest in 1978? Are they able to pick up the threads and continue with their schooling? The answer is no. In actual fact, you have a mass dropout, particularly in Soweto. You have a mass dropout rate of students because high schools are no longer welcoming to students who were part of the student cohort that participated in the 1976-77 movement.
Just be more specific, no longer welcoming, as in openly rejecting applicants for entry.
The first thing that the state would have done was to insist that students actually register at a centralized office. That in itself became a deterrent. No one wanted to interface with officials of state willingly, at that point. So a lot of students, found that quite unwelcoming. But secondly, at the end of 1977,
So in effect, a militarization of the very application process.
Yes,
is
in actual
attachment to the
fact,
security apparatus.
and this would actually unfold in the 1980s. You are right. It was the militarization, of the high school sector. In fact, even in the universities, and probably later we can actually talk about that. The Soweto College itself was, affiliated in some ways with Battalion 21, which was a battalion of the SADF at the time. So indeed, and this had to do with the arrival of P.W. Botha and his military administration, turning civil administration into, a kind of militarized, kind of public service. And this actually happens around this time. But another important factor here is that at the end of 1977, you have mass resignation of teachers. There's a mass resignation of teachers who had been in the system for 20, 25 years, for up to 30 years. So there were new recruits, who were coming from all over the place and actually being placed in the high schools.
The old mission-educated cohort now drops out.
That, in fact, that is the target. The old cohort of teachers,
and
mission trained,
Yes.
were being taken out of the system.
And they are dropping out, and they are dropping out for what reason in particular?
For them, it would have been
What impediments does the state put in their way?
For them, it would have been precisely because, they were becoming conscious of the fact that, serving Bantu education is serving the interests of the apartheid state.
So
That consciousness
yes.
cannot be ruled out.
Yes. All along, they've been able to pretty much keep Bantu education at bay. The full marauding force of Bantu education, the full intended degradation of the black child. That they've been able to keep that threat at bay.
Yes, they were able to keep that at bay precisely because they were coming out of mission schools,
Yes.
quality kind, of education, which they were able to impart. So we may not have had serious problem with the content of what was being taught. The problem here would have been more with structural, aspects of the Bantu education system. Because part of what actually happens is that as a reaction to the 1976-77 movement, what actually happens is that the quality of the teaching personnel is actually downgraded so rapidly that in actual fact, the school system becomes worse off.
And this is by means of institutional engineering on the part
And
of
that
the
institutional engineering involved what? The establishment of colleges of education, such as the Soweto College of Education, the East Rand College of Education. It's interesting to see who the teaching staff, the lecturing staff at the Soweto College of Education was. Some of them were actually demobilized SADF, officers who had absolutely nothing to do and were merely given the job at Soweto College of Education to teach. But in addition to these, you had Bantustan recruits, recruits from the Bantustans, very loyal, to the apartheid state in very many ways. They too taking over, and 4 years later you have Vista established, and you have the same kind of, of culture being imposed, on a black institution of higher learning. So the whole crop of teachers that you do get in the 1980s do not actually come out of the same tradition of the teaching personnel of the 1970s. They actually come from a completely different kind of background.
one in opposition to what had been there before.
Precisely, one in opposition to what the 1976-77 movement would have been about. Exactly.
The long and the short of it is that Bantu education now had free reign, as it were, to do as it pleased on the black African child.
Yes, yeah. But the interesting thing too is the ways in which security forces actually penetrated high schools in the 1980s. And this is something that has never been explained. For instance, when students went on, the first school term, when it ended in March, prefects would be taken on a leadership course, out in Magaliesberg. The interesting thing there is there they interfaced, with members of the SADF who had actually been demobilized during 1977, 1978. And that kind of an institutional relationship, that the security forces established with the high schools was to play itself out during the unrest of the 1980s. It was not unusual to find a group of students in a particular school actually being opposed to COSAS. And the understanding here is that they would be on the same side of the establishment and therefore actually being opposed to COSAS. But I don't think there has been an appreciation, of where this thing actually started. From 1979 right down to 1984, 85, when unrest actually broke out in black townships, already, security forces were penetrating, like I say, not only high schools, but even universities. I've just demonstrated with the Soweto College and Vista University campuses, and it was there. I mean, it was a kind of Afrikaner brother bond, kind of domination of black institutions. And that went on, one might argue, right down to 1993. Okay.
So all in all, I mean, counterinsurgency tactics and stratagems were being applied to black society in its entirety, not merely in the educational sphere.
Yes, and when when you bring up the issue of counterinsurgency, and this is where Stratcom, would have come into the picture, because then Stratcom was able to penetrate all levels of public institutions, have a presence in the high schools, have a presence at Wits University, for instance. I mean, we've had quite a number of trials, coming out of the 1980s and early 90s, where people were actually, the students were actually, you know, acting as security, force agencies. I mean, if you think of a body like the Student Moderate Alliance, which in itself was a creation of the apartheid state and had offices in The Hague, the center of Afrikanerdom in Johannesburg. You had those kinds of things actually happening. Yes, Stratcom was able to penetrate all public institutions. And this was, as you say, this was part of counterinsurgency, that the apartheid state would have actually put into place.
But more profoundly, though, this was all undergirded by a whole demographic strategy and the lifting of influx control and the wholesale replacement of that class of 76 that couldn't get no mobility in society any longer, shut out as it were, unable to gain entry into school and advance themselves, either educationally or economically. So that would have been the...
In fact, that process does not only begin in the aftermath of Black Wednesday. Actually, if you look at state reaction to the 4th of August, to the 13th and 15th of September, to the 22nd of September, these are historical moments, when Soweto's working population, and this also happened in the Cape Peninsula, when the working population was mobilized by students to withhold their labor. And again, the state actually came up with measures and actually pushing and pressurizing the employers to do something with the troubleshooters. And later the troubleshooters became the klepgooiers. So already there, what was beginning to happen is that, jobs were given preferentially to people who were coming from outside of Gauteng. And this actually accelerates in 1979 after the scrapping of the influx control regulations. Because what then happens is that there was a wave of migrations into Gauteng, and already the practice, of sidelining, the remnants of the class of 76, from job opportunities, but also the fact that they couldn't even go back to the schools, and that actually meant that they were being, marginalized and taken out of, income-generating pursuits, in the public sphere. The phenomenon of the unemployed legendary township uncle, comes out of this period, and that is actually what happens. So when you look at the mass movement of the 1980s, it is not a continuation, of the mass movement of the 1970s, precisely because, even in the leadership, of either COSATU or the UDF, there is clearly an underrepresentation, of a continuation of the class of 76. It is actually, new people coming in. And it is understandable. I mean, from the point of view of COSATU itself, it becomes understandable. If Vusi in Soweto cannot get a job here in Boysen and Matume gets it, so Vusi cannot be a member of COSATU, but Matume does become, because he works. And that is how, the kind of social demographics of the workforce was actually being changed from the 1970s into the 1980s. But from a political point of view, it had other, very serious implications, because black townships were not generating, the kind of leadership with ideas, on how to deal with the violence, for instance, how to deal with the popular violence of 84 to 93. There was an absence of any kind of creative and critical thinking, on the part of, say, the UDF leadership, to be able to deal with the IFP in ways that the student movement of the 70s were able to deal with the Zulu phenomenon of 1976. This is because Soweto generated that leadership. and it was a leadership with creative abilities, to deal with that situation. And that is part of the black radical, predisposition that was there in the 1970s, but that was being institutionally eroded in the 1980s. So in actual fact, when next we talk about the 1980s, part of what we will be looking at is the fact that the 1980s mass movement was an anti-black mass movement in the first place. And that's what we have to understand. And the reason why it was an anti-black mass movement is because the thinking process, the think tank, of that movement was not generated by black communities. This is something that we have to deal with. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is no doubt that that mass movement of the 1970s, of the 1980s, was actually initiated in Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town. And part of what you get, which is what I referred to earlier, is that just in terms of framing the struggle, it is a shift away from a struggle for black emancipation. And the struggle becomes something that, a gray area that you need to be in a lecture theater to understand. But finally, what we need to think about again is what is anti-apartheid struggle. The issue here is that Biko was not an anti-apartheid activist. And today we are using that language. But the struggle of the 1970s was not an anti-apartheid struggle. The struggle of the 1970s was a struggle for black emancipation. But there was an anti-apartheid struggle going on. It went on in Washington, it went on in London, it went on in Sweden, in Stockholm. Those people were doing anti-apartheid struggles. The British Labour Party, these are people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. We have to explain at what point did anti-apartheid activism enter the lexicon of the struggle inside South Africa. One of the things that we have to deal with is that the ANC, willingly embraced that label, that the struggle is an anti-apartheid struggle. But for the masses of people inside the country, it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who was who actually pioneered the use of the term anti-apartheid struggle, because he actually became the anti-apartheid activist, par excellence during the period 78 up to 93. He actually became that, and he saw the struggle as that, as an anti-apartheid struggle. But what that actually was doing at the same time, it was a systematic and an institutional attack on black radicalism and taking away what the black radicalism saw as the struggle, the struggle for black emancipation.
In effect, the struggle for black sovereignty.
In actual fact, yes, you are right. Yeah. You are actually
As
right.
against the struggle for mere political rights.
Yes, as opposed to civic rights. I mean, yes, yeah.
Yes. Okay, yeah. So we've got that nailed down. On the other hand, this condemned class, the participant, the remnant of the 76, the class of 76, you began to describe. Could you go further and elaborate on precisely what their fate was? This emptying out of their social agency.
Yeah.
In some other places, I think you've referred to, appropriated the Afro-Pers term of social death.
Yes,
As being their
yeah, and true that true, because I don't think this is a theme or a subject that has actually been dealt with by historians, because we hardly ever ask the question, what happened to the residue of the class of 76? Did they go back to school in 78? And I think I've explained that the environment in the schools was quite hostile and people just stayed away. Yes. So already that gives a sense that if they are not going to be going into jobs, because already there is, although it is not stated in official documents, there is already a policy. And I actually, named that policy the Homeland Labor Preference Policy, because here employers were preferring homeland recruits to recruits of the townships who were stone throwers or klipgooiers during 1976 and 77. So there was an institutional removal of them from the public sphere, from the jobs, as well as from the schools, as I indicated. But here is something more important. Going into the 1980s, it is their children that are becoming politically active in the 1980s. And that's the situation. The situation is that, the unemployed uncle has a child who is probably already in a high school set up by 1985, 1986. And he actually becomes the foot soldier of the popular violence of 1984 to 1993. He necklaces people or he gets necklaced. And that becomes the fate of their children. And and that's the reality that we are having to deal with today. I mean, that's the legacy of black townships in Soweto, in Atteridgeville, in Togoza, across Gauteng. That is what would have happened to that particular demographic.
What happened to this child? Now, if you juxtapose him with your generation, when this child of the 80s came of age, how do you explain the fact that he was such a carrier of violence as against your more socially constructive attitudes in your era, in the 70s?
That's interesting. Partly we have already accounted for this, and I think this is something that may be seen to be rather, probably not particularly, valid, but it is valid. The teaching personnel that came out of mission schools were able to impart the kind of content that was able to cultivate sharper minds in the class of 76. That's a historical fact. By the time you get to 1985, 1986, 10 years later, you are having a whole new recruit, a whole new cohort of recruits, as teaching personnel. Again, I would insist that that was the case in what is today Gauteng or the PWV region back then. That, in fact, was the case. A whole new, kind of teaching staff that has come in. But the most important thing here is that they do not come out of missionary type education. These are actually being, created by Afrikaner institutions, and they are being created for that specific purpose, And the purpose is to downgrade, Bantu education even further, and that was actually, accomplished. So these students would have been taught by people who were, just in terms of the content of what they taught, absolutely incompetent.
I'd say give free rein to the degrading dynamic of Bantu education, to its innate, inherent degrading logic of Bantu education. This is what was
Precisely, yes. But the second thing here is that if black on black violence was defining, how do we explain that? And I think partly, and this is what I'm trying to impress, in a lot of people. Yeah, whenever we talk about, especially comparing the 70s movement to the 80s movement, I always argue that the 1970s movement, would have generated a kind of an injunction that said no political objective is worth pursuing if its realization is dependent upon the visitation of violence on another black body. That is something that came out of the 1970s movement. So there was nothing that could surpass that. And that is something that was ingrained, in the young activists of the 1970s. And hence I still insist to this day that people have to go and really verify at what point Credo Mutwa is being persecuted in Soweto, because it certainly isn't in 1976, but rather in 1982. And this is a completely different, kind of mindset that is at work here when Credo Mutua actually gets persecuted. It is something that here is a record that has to be set straight, that the 1970s movement did not actually produce casualties of black on black violence.
The reality is that the conditions of industrialism and apartheid segregation provided a space for the black socias, if you will.
Yes,
You see
yes,
what I'm saying?
yes.
And with its it's coming apart at during the early part of the 80s with
Yes.
neoliberalism and so on
Yeah,
and so forth.
yeah.
But the very community comes under assault. The very
Yes.
notion of community. So this generation can't rely on any notion of community that yours would have.
Yes, yes, yes.
When it came of
Precisely.
when you all came of age.
Yes.
So they do not have those moorings, if you will, and if you will, open ducks and waiting for exploitation
Precisely.
by any forces.
And also the issue that, in fact, this is the one issue that Achima Feje, actually raises. There is a misunderstanding of what actually happens in Soweto leading up to the 4th of August, because the 4th of August is actually absolutely critical. And this is in response to the issue you've just raised. In what ways did the students get Soweto's working population to support the student movement? There is a perception that in the beginning they simply ignored, the older generation, and that's a misperception. By the 4th of August, already the networks, and these are not networks that were generated only in 1976. These are existing networks, within neighborhoods and between townships. These were very strong networks, that could not be, easily overlooked. And these networks would have extended into the hostels as well. And my concern here is that there's such a misrepresentation of hostels as insulated, completely insulated from what was going on in the townships. Now, the idea of by word of mouth, as a way of communicating messages, actually comes out of the existence of these networks. It was by word of mouth that the stay away of August 4, 1976 was actually organized. So yes, you are right. There was a stronger sense of community, during the 1970s than there would have been in the 1980s. But partly we have already answered that question. We've looked at the changing dynamics, within the workplace, that there isn't any kind of significant presence in the workplace of urban black people who were in the workplace in 1976, 77. The whole thing of a kind of homeland labor preference policy, which was not probably written anywhere, but it was actually being practiced. So in actual fact, the working population, just in terms of their urban experience, would they did not have such a long urban experience as to have been fully integrated into what would have been community networks of the 1970s. So indeed, yes, these cleavages were actually accentuated towards the end of the 1970s with the scrapping of influx control and going into the 1980s. I think the interesting document is, in fact, the 1985 census, report, particularly of Soweto, and comparing that to the 1975 census report. The comparison does actually reflect, this kind of a shift, just in terms of, also in terms of the workforce, who is working in 1985, in these townships.
Right. So in a sense, what society normatively regards as black society totally shifts in the 1980s. There is a new black society, if you will, in the 1980s, with completely new actors that don't have institutional memory of the era that came before.
That were never part of the crucible. That were never part of the crucible of 76, 77.
Yes.
And they dominate the public sphere. This is the point. They dominate the public sphere. The residue of the class of 1976 out of the public picture. Yeah.